The wild Atlantic salmon, the red fish, has been fished along the Scottish coast for hundreds of years by succeeding generations of men from the same families. Generations of fish intermeshed with generations of netsmen. Malcolm Forbes is a fourth-generation netsman. His family have fished the coast between Aberdeen and Cruden Bay for more than 100 years. At the close of the 1999 season, he looks back at his time spent fishing for the red-fleshed king of fish.
Well, the place is closed down now, but there used to be stations all the way along this bay, the Aberdeen Harbour, right along the sands to here, Forvey here, and then further north again the rocks, Cruden Bay. There used to be 3 boats out of Aberdeen Harbour, and there would have been 5 men in each boat, and they worked the fly nets on the beach. That was another couple of men at that. There would have been 6 of our crew at the South Down, 6 of our crew at the North Down, and then there was Berry Hill would have been 5, Black Dog 5 or 6 here, Iggy, there's 5 here, and earlier days, like Blairton, Milldane and that places was individual stations as well, where 4 and 5 were crew. Then the time I started, a lot of them was joined together with their stations. Right along to New Tile and Newborough, for was just well, my father's sail was New Tile, and Newborough was just a couple of men worked jumpers, stake nets along here. And then along to this place here, for there had been 6 of our crew at one time a day here as well.
This red fish, long prized as a delicacy, brought rich rewards to Scottish salmon stations like Forvey and Cruden Bay. Its migratory life cycle once ensured a harvest as predictable as any field of sown barley. Its seed was laid in the shallow gravel beds in the headwaters of Scottish rivers. 20,000 eggs for every hen salmon that managed to elude the nets along the coast and run the gauntlet of the anglers on the rivers. Only a fraction ever survived to ensure that the cycle continued. Every spring, a homing instinct drew the salmon back to the cold rivers of northeast Scotland. Some, the young grilse, are returning to spawn for the first time. It's sometimes several years before the grilse make their first attempt to return to the spawning grounds. In great shoals, along with fully mature salmon that have spawned at least once before, they homed in on their target river mouths. If they swam too close to the shore, there were the nets. If the bag nets didn't trap them, there were the jumper nets on the beach at Forvey, where they were scooped up by netsmen in waders. Not so long ago, each station would have had a crew of around 6 netsmen, waiting to reap this rich harvest. By the mid-80s, there were only 2 or 3 men needed to man the cobble at Cruden Bay. And Malcolm was able to fish the jumper nets at Forvey single-handedly. A trusty 45-year-old tractor, a Fordson Major, was his cobble of the sands. He works in a landscape backed by Forvey's shifting dunes and an ancient castle that saw a Spanish ship carrying the weapons for a rebellion flounder. The north of Cruden Bay, on the way to the bagnets at Dunbuy, another altogether more sinister castle inspired Bram Stoker to write Dracula. Exposed to the elements in their open cobbles or chest deep in icy waters as they fished the beach nets, the netsmen of Cruden Bay and Forvey faced a hard life harvesting the shoals of salmon. Mind you, it wasn't without some simple pleasures.
The wife and the bairns used to come and bide out here all summer, and they used to come out to start the holidays and with an old caravan down the side of the store here and belong to the company like it. The kids all bed here. It was really a good time. It was, you just lived in the place. It was just a way of life and the job was going on along with it. And it was a good time. We was making reasonable fishings and it was just an excellent way for me to live. You can, the wife being here and the bairns being here, and I think it was, that few years was, I would say, best part of my life, I think.
On both the sea and beach nets, long leaders created a barrier mesh to guide the salmon into the box-like bag and jumper nets. Their effectiveness depends on the salmon swimming very close to shore.
Bag net, which was with a cobble, and the fly nets, which was, they needed enough of stakes, they were huge. They all staked up, the leader was staked, and the jumpers, the whole idea of the thing is the same, they're really the same principle. They're just a cage, a trap, and with a long bit of net, it was for the shore seaward, attached to the main net, which is called the leader. And the idea is for fish to come along with the tide, whether it's flood tide or ebb tide, for the north to the south or for the south to the north. They come up against this obstacle, this leader, and they would follow the leader and eventually land in the trap.
It was back in 1980 that Malcolm took on the fishing at Forvey. He was employed by the Cruden Bay Salmon Company. They leased the rights to work both the Forvey and the Cruden Bay fishery. Like Malcolm, Bertie Bruce and Joseph Yule, the partners in the company, had salmon fishing in their blood. The beach itself was part of the Forvey National Nature Reserve, with its unspoilt heathland and shifting dunes. Other than Nature Conservancy personnel, Malcolm was the only person making a living on Forvey. Scottish Natural Heritage is now responsible for the reserve. At Forvey, its role is both to manage and conserve the timeless landscape and to interpret it for visitors. Malcolm and his jumper nets on the beach are part of that heritage.
During the war, apparently the army put invasion poles along us sands here, right along the beaches. This was to prevent enemy planes from landing, and they used water pumps. And the salmon fishers couldn't do the idea. It was a jet of water. It displaced the sand, and the stakes just fell in, the big poles just fell into the sand. And they thought this would be a brilliant idea.
These anti-aircraft poles were removed shortly after the end of the war. Other fortifications have been more enduring. Tank traps appear and disappear, exposed and buried again by the wind-blown sand. They're reminders of a time when nothing, except the runs of salmon, could be predicted. For a while, in more peaceful times, catches of more than 100 fish from a single net were not uncommon. At Forvey, with its jumper nets, and at Cruden Bay, with its bag nets in the sea, prosperous season merged into prosperous season. The anchors and nets went in February and were lifted again in September. Work was governed by the ebb and flood of the tide. Over the course of a season, the Cruden Bay bag nets were set from the great natural arch at Dunbuy in the north to the leeward of the jagged reef at the Skares of Cruden in the south. At Forvey, More than a dozen jumper nets staked a claim to the expected shoals of salmon. The nets were fished twice a day during slack water at low tide. By the late 70s, stocks of salmon appeared to be in decline. As a conservation measure, legislation was brought in to disable the nets over the weekend. The leaders on the sea nets were lifted and the doors on the beach nets opened wide to the sea. Any fish that were accidentally caught were free to escape. On Mondays, the leaders were reset at sea and the doors closed on the jumpers. The nets were ready to fish again. During the early 90s, catches of salmon all round the Scottish coast began to really decline. Fishing at many stations was no longer economical. Net poles were bare, and net anchors lay unused along the shoreline. There seemed to be no satisfactory explanation for the decline in the numbers of the once plentiful red fish. So where were they? And why were they no longer following their hereditary course along the Scottish coast to their birthing grounds? Theories as to the cause of the dwindling numbers of salmon were wide-ranging. Overfishing, pollution, an expanding and predatory seal population, sea lice from escaped farm fish, deep-sea fishing, disease, climatic change, and ocean currents not flowing the way they used to, were all considered as possible causes. No single factor emerged as the reason for this apparent change in the behavior of the salmon. At the same time, fishing boats reported sighting huge shoals of salmon several miles offshore. The majority seemed to be staying well out to sea before making their run into the river estuaries. The North Atlantic Salmon Fisheries Trust responded to the crisis by offering to buy out the rights to stake net salmon fishings. Many proprietors were keen to sell. More stations were abandoned all along the coast. Contrary to the trend, Bertie and Joseph decided to continue fishing. It was their way of life, just as it was Malcolm's. They were bred to it, and their days were still full. There were leader nets to make, each man with his own handcrafted needle whittled from wood the way their grandfathers had shown them. And for as long as they carried on fishing, there were nets to hoist, clean and dry, ready to exchange for the ones at sea that were awaiting a run of fish. But there were no more runs of fish. Only a few stragglers from the great shows reported by the trawlermen.
Just things gradually declined. There was changes in the 50s and 60s. Some of the stations kind of trimmed down on crews, and less crews started working at places. Just as the years has gone on, especially this last decade, since we come into the 90s now, there's no fish available.
At its peak, it had been an industry employing several thousand men, building cobbles, net making, and boxing the catch to be sold at London's Billingsgate Market. Today, in the shadow of Canary Wharf, most of the salmon up for auction are of a tamer, farmed breed. Reared in cages and sea lochs on Scotland's west coast, they provide a cheaper, more reliable harvest than the runs of wild, sea-bred salmon. The 1998 season had barely begun when severe gales lashed at the northeast coast of Scotland. Waves pounded the shore. Powerful undertows undermined the nets along the beach at Forvey. Poles collapsed, and the gear was wrecked. Forvey was abandoned and not fished again during 1998. For the first time in 18 years, there were no nets along the shoreline between the rocks at Sand End and the mouth of the Eithne. Malcolm moved north to help man the cobble at Cruden Bay. The beach was left as the preserve of seabirds, ducks, and waders. Their solitude was only disturbed by SNH staff with parties of school kids or occasional picnickers. Working from the shelter of the harbour at Cruden Bay, Malcolm, Bertie and Joseph experienced one of the poorest seasons on record. And where once there were a few dozen seals, there were now several hundred, with more and more taking salmon from the nets and always dining on the choicest cuts. The netsmen fit sonar devices to the nets to frighten the seals, but also sometimes exercise their licensed authority to shoot them. Faced with such numbers of predators, their efforts seem to have little effect. Only a net-making contract with the oil industry kept the crew in full-time work. That, and something in the blood, continued to draw Bertie, Joseph, and Malcolm to fish 2 tides a day.
The scientists just studying water temperature and all the rest of it. They would suggest it's maybe global warming, whatever. I'm not qualified to comment on it. But they've certainly changed their habits. The fish isn't coming into the bitties for a wee working day. Places it used to be lucrative, we used to kind of ken your best nets, especially in the rock stations, you'd have kent your positions of your best nets, and we used to do what's in the past. So now in this last couple of years especially, it's just getting to be, it's just the job's not economical.
1999 didn't get any better. But for a while at least, the routine of fishing and maintaining a full fleet of nets meant that there was still plenty to do. Clean nets, however, are not enough to attract a run of fish. No lure has ever been able to do that. Only the homing instinct of the red fish guarantee the once predictable harvest. Something had altered that homing instinct. By now, Cruden Bay and Forvey were among only a few salmon stations still working on the Scottish coast. Sometimes it seemed that the only fish being caught were by boys on the rocks at the back of the pier at Cruden Bay. With no improvement in catches, Bertie took the decision to lift the northernmost nets at Dunbuy early. With specially strengthened rollers fitted fore and aft on the cobble, the buoys that located the anchors were lifted on board. The cobble nudged ahead slowly, hauling the heavy chain and anchor up from the seabed. Lashed to the prow of the cobble, the anchors were brought back to Cruden Bay Harbour. There wasn't much left to do, except scrape the barnacles and wheat from the buoys. Hoisted onto the quayside, the anchors were monuments to the great runs of fish that had once filled the nets. Bertie and Joseph could cope with the remaining Cruden Bay bag nets on their own. And so Malcolm returned to fish off the beach at Forvey. Along almost 3 miles of gently shelving sand, he rigged his nets. Using the hydraulic technique learned from the army during World War II, the stakes sank into the sand like a hot knife through butter. If only the fishing was as straightforward. Despite an encouraging start with some large salmon caught, the numbers of fish caught by Malcolm remained low. With no improvements in catches, he stopped fishing in late August 1999. The nets and gear were gathered in and stowed away. The tractor was garaged and the door bolted. There had been a time before when poor catches had left Forvey bare of nets. Perhaps these kings of fish, these redfish, might once again gather in numbers to make a run close inshore for their target river mouths. Just as Bertie and Joseph intend to carry on fishing from their cobble at Cruden Bay, perhaps Malcolm will fish from the beach again. Perhaps.